Hi everyone, my name is Lena Kremin and I'll be talking about how to improve data visualizations by increasing transparency and incorporating findings from the field of cognitive psychology. Now before we dive in, I want us all to imagine that we are a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed master's student working on our thesis, visualizing our own data for the very first time. We end up with a visualization that looks something like this, which we're pretty proud of. It looks fairly good. But at the end of this presentation, we're going to circle back to this visualization and see how we can actually make it even better. So why are data visualizations important? Well, they're an important part of the research process, all the way from beginning your analyses to communicating your findings. And visualizations are pretty easy to create nowadays with all of the technology and software that we have, but these automatically generated visualizations aren't always necessarily the best for infant data. Data visualizations are also really important because they allow us to look at the structure of our data. Let's say you have 4 data sets. When you visualize them, you can see that they look something like this. And they're obviously all very different. But if you were to just look at the descriptive statistics, you probably wouldn't have known that they were this different because they all have the same X values, mean Y values, correlations, linear regression lines. So being able to visualize the data and actually look at the data changes your perception of the structure of your data. This allows us to check for abnormalities before running any statistics, such as checking if our data is normally distributed before running our t-test. But data visualizations are also increasingly important for transparency. So we want our data visualizations to mirror the trend in psychology towards more transparent practices. And part of this is including in reproducibility. If we're transparent in our data visualizations, it's easier for others to reproduce our work. One group, the bar plots group, argues that bar plots are actually not very good data visualizations because they're not transparent. Bar plots with a single summary statistic and maybe some error bars don't really give you a full understanding of the data. So let's quick look at an example of this. This is some data that I've been working with recently. Let's start off with a typical bar plot. We see the mean value at 10 and 18 months with some error bars. We can see that it increases from 10 to 18 months, but beyond that, we don't really know much of what's going on with our data. So to increase the transparency, we can first add individual data points on top of the bar plot. This automatically gives us a really good look into what is happening at 10 months and at 18 months. We can see that the spread of the data is much different. If we want to take it even one step further, we can get rid of the bar plots altogether and actually draw lines in between 10 and 18 months, since this was longitudinal data, and then we can add in a red line signifying the average at both of these time points. So what I want you to take away from this is not only can data transparency in our visualizations help share what's going on with our data, but data visualization and transparency is an iterative process. So you may need to go through a couple different graphs, testing things out to see what really works best for your individual data. Now, at a previous vICIS show, Suji did a really great presentation on how to increase the transparency of your data visualizations. So in this presentation, I'll mostly be focusing on how we can make these transparent data visualizations easier to read and easier to interpret for our readers. For this, we can tap into some cognitive and perceptual biases that we all have. And some of the most important ones are the Gestalt principles, color perception, and memory limitations. Now, you may remember the Gestalt principles from your Intro to Psychology class. And the Gestalt principles are grouping principles. When we see items that are close to each other or similar to each other in color or shape, or items that are connected or enclosed within another shape, we tend to perceive those items as belonging to the same group. Gestalt principles can help your reader in data discovery and understanding, and they can actually improve the visual working memory of your reader so they can better understand your data visualization, and your results. So how can we apply these Gestalt principles to transparent data? Well, let's take a look at another example. Here we have some violin plots showing the density of the groups, the data at each of these groups. However, it's not exactly the easiest to read. We see that some of the individual data points are actually falling outside of the violin plots themselves, which can lead to some confusion as to which group those dots belong to. If we apply the Gestalt principle of enclosure, bringing all those individual data points within their respective violin plot, we can make the visualization much easier to interpret. Another important note here is the use of color. Each of the colors represents a different group, which brings us to how to implement color in the most effective way. So color is an increasingly important part of data visualizations as more of our graphs are being shown online or in conferences, as opposed to being printed black and white in a paper journal. Color can be better than arbitrary symbols for grouping for that Gestalt principle of similarity. However, when you're choosing your color, you want to account for the perceptual differences of your readers. So this could, for example, this could be color blindness. And when you're choosing color, you also want to choose your colors based on the structure of your data. Now, this is a lot to keep in mind when you're choosing your colors, but there are tools online that can help you do this. My go-to is Color Brewer, and with Color Brewer, you can set the number of data classes you have, what type of data you have. You can even check this box to make it colorblind safe, so it will only show you colors that can be perceived by those with color blindness. And then it gives you hex codes, which you can just plug right into your R code, which is what I do for my data visualizations. While these tools can be great, we still have to use them and think critically when we do. So that involves us knowing the structure of our own data. For example, if you have nominal data, that means you have distinct groups within your data set, but there's no inherent order to those groups. So you want the colors that you choose to reflect that structure of your data. You want the colors to be distinct, but not have an inherent order, just like the structure of your data. So here we can see there's green, orange, and purple, all distinct colors, but in no perceptible order for our readers. You could also have ordinal data. So ordinal data is similar in that you do have distinct groups, but now there is an inherent order to those groups. One type of ordinal data you may encounter a lot when you're studying infancy is age. So here we see that there are specific age groups, but that there is an inherent order. There's an inherent order to the age, youngest to oldest. And then the colors that were chosen reflected the distinct groups, but the inherent order of those groups going from a lighter to a darker shade. And then lastly, you could have continuous data. So when you have continuous data, you want to have a continuous color gradient that can reflect all of those continuous values. There are different color gradients available. It doesn't necessarily have to be the rainbow. It could just be one color with different gradients. So to see how I apply these principles of color, this is the first data visualization I made in R with my own data, and it's a little rough, I'll be honest. So we can see that the colors that were applied here were the default nominal color scheme in R, which is good because it does reflect that my data had different groups. However, what it's missing was that two of these groups actually share a broader category within the data. So I had two overarching groups, and then one of those groups had two subgroups, and I wanted to change the colors to reflect that. Also, you'll see that this y-axis is not the most informative about the data, so I also changed that for the final visualization as well. And this is the final visualization. I chose colors that reflected the structure of my data. So I had two overarching groups, one blue and one green, but then within the blue group, I was able to choose two distinct colors of blue to reflect that there were two groups within that larger overarching group. And then lastly, memory limitations. So the goal for us as designers of these data visualizations should be to reduce the cognitive load for our readers. And this can be done by drawing the reader's attention to the most important elements of the visualization. So for example, here's again is the first pass at a visualization. It's a little overwhelming to read, and so there's a lot that can be done to improve this visualization. So for example, in the final version, what was done was that the most important information was highlighted. So this draws the reader's attention right to what's most relevant for the research question in that study. You can also see that there are direct and redundant labels. Redundant labels increase efficiency and comprehension, and having them being directly on the graph as opposed to the legend also helps readers process the information. And as a bonus, we can see that there are appropriate colors for the structure of the data. Now that we've learned about how to incorporate transparency and cognitive biases into our visualizations, let's go back to our visualization that we made for our master's thesis. But now you're a second-year PhD student who's learned a lot about data visualizations, and you're kind of rethinking your previous work. From this previous visualization, automatically we can see that there's a lack of transparency. With the bar plots, we really don't know what's going on beneath those plots. And then we also can see that the colors are maybe not so great, that it's a little difficult to tell the dark gray from this striped color. So we apply what we've learned, and we end up with a visualization that looks something like this. First of all, we added in individual data points, so the transparency is automatically increased. We also changed the color to reflect the underlying structure of our data. So we have two distinct colors representing two distinct phases within the study. So to conclude, we can improve our data visualizations first and foremost by increasing the transparency. But once we increase the transparency, there are some other things that we have to consider in order to make our visualizations easy to read. This can be choosing appropriate colors for the structure of your data, tapping into perceptual biases that your readers have, and reducing the cognitive load for your readers so that they spend more time interpreting your graph as opposed to trying to figure out how to read it. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email or tweet me, and I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.